Hey guys, welcome back to Daily Kaylee. Today is the first episode of 13 Days of Halloween. Today's episode is actually about Richard Speck. If you don't know who Richard Speck is, season 1 of American Horror Story is heavily influenced by him and his crimes. You'll see why. The Richard Speck murders take place in 1966. He was 25 at the time of committing these murders. I'm trying to come up with a better intro, but I really just want to jump right in, so let's go ahead. Richard Speck was born in Illinois. He was the 7th of 8 children, and he has a younger sister named Carolyn. All of his older siblings are significantly older than him. So his younger sister Carolyn is pretty much his closest sibling. When Richard was 6, his father died of a heart attack. And when he was 12, his oldest brother, Robert, died in a car accident. After his father died, his crazy religious mother fell in love with a traveling insurance salesman from Texas named Carl. She met him on a train trip to Chicago. And this is out of the ordinary for Richard's mom because Carl is absolutely not her type at all. He's not religious. He is a hard alcoholic. He has a 25-year criminal record, which includes forgery of legal documents and several arrests for drunk driving. Now, Richard's biological father, he was literally the exact opposite of Carl. He was super hardworking, he was sober, which is the main difference, and he was just a good man. So the fact that his mom is now falling in love with Carl, it's just super off, unlike her. Probably one of the worst things she could have done for her son, and you'll see why. Now, Richard's mother married Carl on May 10th, 1950, in Texas. Richard and his younger sister actually stayed with their older sister Sarah in Illinois for a few months so they could finish school before moving to Texas with their new stepfather, Carl. So, literally in the 2nd grade, he had to pack up and move all the way across the country, pretty much, to Texas from Illinois. They only spent a year in Santo, Texas, which is where Carl was from. It's about 40 miles west of Fort Worth, Texas, if you've never heard of it, because I never had. He only spent a year in school there before they moved again to Dallas, Texas. Over the next 10 years, they lived at 10 different houses in different parts of Texas. Richard hated his stepfather. He was a drunk, and he was never home with the children. He also psychologically abused Richard with insults and threats constantly. Richard struggled in school and eventually dropped out of the 9th grade at 16. He one of the main reasons he was bad in school is because he needed glasses, but he would refuse to wear them because he was picked on. He also refused to speak in class because he had a lifelong fear of people staring at him, which is also why he refused to wear the glasses. Before he dropped out of the 9th grade, he had to repeat the 8th grade, and he actually failed every single class the first semester of his 9th grade year. Richard started drinking alcohol at the age of 12, and by 15, he was drunk almost every single day. He clearly inherited this from his stepfather's behavior, and his mother did nothing about it. He was first arrested at the age of 13 for trespassing, and over the next 8 years, he had dozens of arrests for misdemeanors in Texas. At 19, he worked at 7-Up and bottled the drinks for about 3 years. Also, at 19, he met 15-year-old Shirley Malone at the Texas State Fair. After 3 weeks of dating, she was already pregnant. They got married the next year in 1962. And she initially moved in with him, his mother, sister, and stepfather. After this, Richard's mom and Carl separated, and Carl moved to California. So he was finally out of Richard's life, which would have been a good thing if he hadn't grown up with this man and was literally already permanently influenced by him. I don't know if this was customary in the 60s, but after his father died and his mother married Carl, him and his sister actually took Carl's last name. I think that's extremely strange. I don't know if it was a big thing back then or if it was just something that their mother wanted them to do. But after they separated, Richard went back to using the last name Speck. After he married Shirley, she also took the last name Speck. And actually, when their daughter was born on July 5th, 1962, Shirley had no idea where Richard was because he was actually serving a 22-day jail sentence for disturbing the peace in McKinney, Texas, after being drunk at a bar. The following July, in 1963, Richard was caught after he forged a signature and cashed a coworker's paycheck, which was only $44. He also robbed a grocery store. He got away with cigarettes, beer, and $3 in cash, so I'm sure it was worth it. He was only 21, and he was convicted of forgery and burglary. He was only 21, and he was convicted of robbery and forgery, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He actually got on parole after only serving 16 months. 1 week after his parole, Richard was caught wielding a carving knife when he tried to attack a woman in the parking lot of her apartment building. He fled when she screamed, and the police arrived within minutes and arrested him once again. He was convicted of aggravated assault, given another 16-month sentence, and returned to the same prison. Somehow, though, there was an error in the jail, and he was released 6 months later. And also, they considered him as completing his parole sentence. So I guess he just gets really lucky. After he was released from prison, he worked for 3 months as a driver for the Patterson Meat Company in Texas. And he had 6 accidents in his truck before he was finally fired. They must have really trusted this man. In December of 1965, Richard was separated from his wife and actually moved in with a 29-year-old divorced woman. She was an ex-professional wrestler, and she actually bartended at his favorite bar, Jenny's Lounge. She needed a babysitter for her 3 kids, so he thought this was the perfect opportunity to make some money and have somewhere to stay. The following January, Richard's wife filed for divorce. That same month, Richard stabbed a man in a knife fight at the bar where his roommate worked. He was once again charged with aggravated assault, but his mother hired him a defense attorney, and they actually got his charge reduced to disturbing the peace, even though he literally stabbed a man. It is what it is. Richard was fined $10 and then jailed for 3 days because he could not pay the fine. This is the last time that Richard was in police custody in Dallas, which is where they moved when he was a kid. A couple months later, on March 5th, 1966, Richard bought a 12-year-old car. It doesn't say what kind. It was the 60s, so you can imagine. The next evening, he robbed another grocery store, stole 70 cartons of cigarettes, and sold them out of the trunk of the car in the grocery store's parking lot. He then abandoned the car in the parking lot. The police obviously traced the car to Richard as he just bought it the day before, issued a warrant for his arrest, and he fled. His sister drove him to the Dallas bus stop where he took a bus to Chicago. He knew that if he got arrested again, he would go back to prison. He had been arrested 42 times in Dallas. So, this next part is between March and April of 1966. This is when he first arrives back in Illinois after being in Dallas for the majority of his life. He's staying with his sister Martha and her family in Chicago for a few days. And then he got on a bus and went to his hometown of Monmouth, Illinois. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He initially stayed with some old family friends, and then his brother was actually still living there and got him a job. This job was basically just him sanding plasterboard for a carpenter. This is when Richard finds out that his wife had remarried after 2 days of being divorced. This made him super angry for, I have no idea why, because I feel like he definitely did not love his wife. Regardless, he moved into a hotel in the downtown area on March 25th, and he spent most of his time in downtown bars. At the end of March, Richard and some of his friends were bar hopping on a trip between 2 cities in Illinois, and they were actually detained overnight by police because Richard reportedly threatened a man in a bar bathroom with a knife. That sounds just like Richard. I believe that 100%. On April 3rd, Mrs. Virgil Harris, a 65-year-old resident of Richard's hometown, came home at 1 a.m. and found a burglar in her house with a knife. She described him as being a 6-foot-tall white man who was very polite and spoke very softly with a southern drawl. He blindfolded her, tied her up, raped her, robbed her house, including the $2.50 that she had earned from babysitting that evening. The police believe this to be Richard, although he was never convicted of this crime. And a week later, Mary Catherine Pierce, a 32-year-old barmaid who worked at her brother's tavern, was last seen leaving the tavern at 12:20 a.m. on April 9th. She was officially reported missing on the 13th, and her body was found that day in an empty hog house behind the bar. Her autopsy report showed that she had died from a blow to her abdomen that ruptured her liver. This is also believed to be one of Richard's first crimes. The reason they believe Richard to be involved with this is because Richard frequented the bar. He also helped build the empty hog house literally just the following month, or the previous month. The police briefly questioned him about her death because he showed up to receive his final paycheck on April 15th. They asked him to stay in town for further questioning, but when they showed up at the hotel he was living in a couple days later to continue questioning him, they discovered that he had left the hotel a few hours earlier. He told the lady at the front desk that he was just going to the laundromat because he had a few suitcases with him, but of course he skipped town. They searched his room just to see if they could find anything, and they actually found a radio and costume jewelry that Mrs. Harris had reported missing from her house. And they also discovered items that were reported missing in 2 other robberies in the past month. He leaves Monmouth and goes to Chicago. He went back to stay with his sister Martha in her second-floor apartment. She lived there with her husband Gene, and they had 2 teenage daughters. Gene had served in the U.S. Navy, and he thought that being a Marine would be a suitable occupation for his brother-in-law. So he took Richard to the Coast Guard office to apply for a letter of authority to work as an apprentice. The application required being fingerprinted and photographed, and he had to have a physical by a doctor. This is important, I promise. Richard pretty much found work immediately after he got the letter of authority, and he actually joined the crew of Inland Steel's Clarence B. Randall, which was a lake freighter, on April 30th. Richard's first voyage on the Clarence B. Randall was pretty brief because he was actually stricken with appendicitis on May 3rd. He was evacuated by the Coast Guard helicopter to St. Joseph's Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, and he actually had an emergency appendectomy. After he was discharged from the hospital, he went back to stay with his sister and her family in Chicago, and on May 20th, he rejoined the crew until June 14th, when he got drunk and got into a fight with one of the boat's officers. So they were pretty much like, screw you, you're getting off the following day. He stayed at the St. Elmo, which was a flop house in Chicago, and then traveled by train to Houghton, Michigan, where he stayed at the Douglas House. I'm not sure if that's important or not, but I'm going to let you know. He actually went there to visit a nurse named Judy, who was 28 and going through a divorce. He befriended her when he was in St. Joseph's Hospital, and she actually ended up giving him $80 until he found work. He once again left to stay with his sister Martha and her family in Chicago for the next couple of weeks. Now, this is when it gets very crucial that you pay attention. This is some serious shit. Okay, so, on June 30th, 1966, Gene drives Richard back to the National Maritime Union hiring call. That's, if you know what that is, great. He filed his paperwork for a seaman's card and all that. It's not really that important. But the hiring call was 1 block east of 5 two-story townhouses. These were occupied by the South Chicago Community Hospital student nurses. These 3 student nurses were actually exchange students, and 8 more registered nurses lived in another townhouse, which was about 150 feet away from the hiring call as well. By the following Monday, he had pretty much outstayed his welcome with his sister Martha and her family. He'd been staying with them off and on for months. So he packed his bags again. Gene drove him back to the hiring call, and he pretty much awaited a job on a ship. He stayed the night at Pauline's rooming house, which is about a mile away from South Deering, Chicago. On Tuesday, he returned to the hiring call. Mid-afternoon, he received an assignment on Sinclair Oil's tanker, SS Sinclair Great Lakes, which is about a 30-minute drive away in East Chicago, Indiana. When he arrived there, he found that his spot had already been taken, so he had to drive all the way back to the hiring call, which at this point was closed. Richard didn't have any money to spend on a rooming house, so he dropped his bags off 6 blocks east at a Shell gas station, slept in an unfinished house, and pretty much waited out the night. The following day, on Wednesday, July 13th, he picked up his bags and checked in at the hiring call again. He was super pissed off because they gave him an assignment that basically did not exist anymore. So his sister and her husband drove back down to visit him, and he talked in the car with them for about 30 minutes. They were parked next to Luella Elementary School, which is right across the street from the townhouses where all of the nurses lived. By 10:30 a.m., he was so tired of waiting at the hiring call looking for a job. He had $25 left over from money that his sister had given him, so he left and walked about a mile and a half east to check in at the Shipyard Inn, which was a rooming house. He spent the rest of the day drinking in nearby bars before he approached Ella Mae Hooper with a knife. She was a 53-year-old woman who had also spent the day drinking at these bars. At knife point, he took her back to his room at the Shipyard Inn, raped her, and stole her black pistol, which at this time costed $16. Can you imagine buying a pistol for $16? I mean, to be fair, they made like 40 cents an hour, if that, but still. After this, he went to eat dinner, a normal evening, and then he returned to drink at the Shipyard Inn's bar until 10:20 p.m. When he left, he was dressed entirely in black, and he was armed with a switchblade and Ella Mae's handgun. After leaving the bar, he walked about a mile and a half straight to the nurse's townhouse. Now, keep in mind, he's never been inside these townhomes. He has no idea who lives there at this time. But that's where he's going. At around 11 p.m. on July 13th, 1966, Richard broke into the townhouse. The townhouse was pretty much like a dormitory for the student nurses. They all lived there. They shared rooms. He entered, and using only his switchblade, he killed Gloria Davy, Patricia Mitsuik, Nina Jo Small, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Mary Ann Jordan, Marlita Gargulo, and Valentina Passion. He killed all 8 of these nurses, only using the knife. Richard later claimed that he was drunk and high on drugs, and he thinks that he originally planned only to commit like a routine robbery, as if that makes anything better. To make matters worse, Richard held these women in a room for hours, and he would lead them out one by one, stabbing or strangling each of them to death. Finally, Gloria Davy was his last victim, and he raped her before he strangled her to death. One woman, Corazon Amaru, escaped death because she crawled and hid under a bed while Richard was out of the room. Richard either lost count of the nurses, or he knew that only 8 women lived in the townhouse, and that he did not realize a 9th woman was spending the night. She stayed hidden until almost 6 a.m. Fingerprints found at the scene were matched to Richard's fingerprints from the Navy office. 2 days after the murders, Richard was identified by a drifter. The drifter's name was Claude Lunsford, and Lunsford actually knew Richard because him, Richard, and another man actually spent the evening of July 15th drinking on the fire escape of the Star Hotel. On July 16th, Lunsford recognized a sketch of the murderer in the evening paper and called the police at 9:30 p.m. after finding Richard in his room at the Star Hotel. The police did not respond to the call, even though the records showed that the call had been made. Apparently, Richard then attempted suicide, and the Star Hotel desk clerk called in the emergency hotline at midnight. Richard was taken to the Cook County Hospital around 12:30 a.m. on July 17th. At the hospital, Richard was recognized by Dr. Smith, who was a 25-year-old resident physician. He had read about his tattoo in the newspaper. His tattoo said, "Born to Raise Hell." He obviously identified the tattoo from the pictures of him in the paper, called the police immediately. This is when Richard was arrested. This is the same time when Miranda versus Arizona was a huge deal. So they literally did not question him for 3 weeks after he was arrested because there were so many concerns that they were going to do something to completely fuck up this case. The judge residing over Richard's case had a whole panel of physicians and psychiatrists to report on Richard's competence to stand trial. Pretty much they wanted to know if he was sane enough to actually go on trial. The panel was made up of 3 physicians, which were suggested by the defense, 3 physicians that were selected by the prosecution, and 5 psychiatrists, including 1 general surgeon. Each one of them deemed that he was perfectly sane at the time of these murders. While he was awaiting trial, Richard actually participated in twice weekly sessions with the Cook County Jail psychiatrist, Dr. Marvin Zaporin. He continued these sessions up until the day before he stood trial, which was February 13th, 1967. Dr. Zaporin's discharge summary included that Richard was full of depression, anxiety, guilt, and love for his family. It also went on to note an obsessive-compulsive personality and a Madonna prostitute attitude towards women. If you don't know what a Madonna prostitute attitude is, basically, it's officially called the Madonna whore complex. It's when a man is unable to maintain arousal within a committed, loving relationship. So he does not see women as a potential for any sort of romantic relationship. He only sees women as there to have sex with. He also went on and said that he used to view women as almost saint-like. And then suddenly he felt betrayed by them for absolutely no reason. And that is when his hostility towards women developed. He also believes that this could have stemmed from his mother as a young boy. Maybe it happened when she married Carl, and he saw what kind of person Carl was, so he resented his mother for bringing him into his life. I have no idea. That's actually just my theory. So take that with a grain of salt. Dr. Zaporin tried so hard to help Richard. He diagnosed him with organic brain syndrome, which he said resulted from injuries that he had suffered in Richard's early life. He also said that he was perfectly sane to stand trial, but he was insane at the time of the crime due to the effects of alcohol and drug use on this syndrome. However, Dr. Zaporin refused to testify for the defense or the prosecution. And they learned that he actually was writing a book about Richard for financial gain. The Cook County Jail actually ended up firing him because they were also pissed off that he was writing this book just to make money off of this case. His book was actually published in the summer of 1967, and apparently at some point during all of his interviews with Richard, Dr. Zaporin had obtained a written 3-sentence consent from Richard Speck because he wanted Dr. Zaporin to tell the world what he was really like. Interesting. Now, Richard claimed that he had no recollection of the murders, even though while he was in the Cook County Hospital, he confessed the crime to Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith didn't testify because this confession was made while Richard was sedated and being treated. The Supreme Court Justice, who was working when this case was going on, said that they actually did not need the hospital confession because there was an eyewitness. Richard actually confessed to the murders for the first time in public when he spoke to a Chicago journalist in 1978. There was a film made of inmates at the Stateville Correctional Center in 1988, and Richard recounted the brutal murders in detail. He once again said that he was high that night, but then he undercut the idea that the drugs were actually any factor at all, and he asserted that he could just as well have done it sober. Richard's trial began in April of 1967 in Illinois. There was a gag order on the press. They were not allowed to cover any of this story until the trial was over. In court, Richard was obviously positively identified by the surviving student nurse, Corazon Amaro. When Amaro was asked if she could identify the killer, she rose from her seat in the witness box, walked directly in front of Richard, pointed her finger at him, and almost touched him, and said, "This is the man." The lieutenant at the Navy office also testified regarding that the fingerprints were indeed a match. On April 15th, after only 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury found him guilty and recommended the death penalty. On June 5th, Richard was sentenced to die in the electric chair, but he was granted an immediate stay pending automatic appeal. Which really didn't matter, because on November 22nd, 1968, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction and his death sentence. On June 28th, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld his conviction as well, but they reversed his death sentence. The reason that they did this is because more than 250 of the potential jurors for his case were unconstitutionally excluded from his jury because of their conscientious or religious beliefs against capital punishment. So the case was sent right back to the Illinois Supreme Court for resent. However, on June 29th, 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional. So the Illinois Supreme Court's only option was to order Richard to be resentenced to prison. On November 21st, 1972, back in Illinois, the same judge resentenced Richard to spend 400 to 1,200 years in prison. He was denied parole within 7 minutes at his first parole hearing on September 15th, 1976. And once again, 6 more times in 1977, 78, 81, 84, 87, and 1990. He was incarcerated at the Stateville Correctional Center, which I've already said. He was actually given the name Birdman after the film Birdman of Alcatraz because he kept a pair of sparrows that had flown into his cell. He was described as a loner, and he actually kept a stamp collection, and he enjoyed listening to music. The warden pretty much described him as a nobody who was doing time. He was often caught with drugs or moonshine, and his punishment never stopped him, and he was actually once quoted saying, "How am I going to get in trouble? I'm in here for 1,200 years." Richard actually hated reporters. He absolutely wanted no attention whatsoever. He just wanted to be left alone. He only had one press interview, and that was in 1978 with the journalist, where he confessed to the murders for the first time. At this time, he said that he thought he would get out of prison between now, which was 1978, and the year 2000. And apparently he hoped to run his own grocery store business, even though he literally robbed I don't know how many grocery stores. When the journalist asked him if he compared himself to celebrity killers, he replied, "Me, I'm not like anybody else. I'm freakish." He stated that at the time of the killings, he had absolutely no feelings, but that things apparently had changed. He said, "I had no feelings at all that night. They said there was blood all over the place. I can't remember. It felt like nothing. I'm sorry as hell for those girls and for their families and for me. If I had to do it over again, it would be a simple robbery." Apparently, his final thought for the American people, as quoted by the journalist, was, "Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know it keeps up their morale, and I don't know what I'd do without it." I'm sure very sarcastically. An FBI agent by the name of John Douglas actually wrote a book called Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. And he actually refers to Richard in this book. In this book, he tells about a prison incident that Richard actually told him about in an interview. This goes back to the sparrows that were supposedly in his cell. Richard found an injured sparrow that had flown in through one of the broken windows, and he nursed it back to health. Whenever it was healthy enough to stand up, he tied a string around its leg and had it perch on his shoulder until it was healthy enough to stand on its own. At one point, a guard told him that pets weren't allowed for I don't know what reason. They're in fucking prison. Richard said, "I can't have it." The guard obviously said no, and he walked over to a spinning fan and threw the small bird in it. The guard was horrified, and he said, "I thought you liked that bird." Richard said, "I did, but if I can't have it, no one can." In May of 1996, Chicago television news anchor Bill Curtis received videotapes made at the Stateville Correctional Center in 1988 from an anonymous attorney. They were shown publicly for the first time in front of the Illinois state legislature. Curtis pointed out there were crazy scenes of sex, drug use, and money being passed around by prisoners who had absolutely no fear of being caught. In the center of the video was Richard, who was performing oral sex on another inmate, sharing a large quantity of cocaine with another inmate who was parading around in silk panties and had female breast because he had been smuggling in hormone treatments. Richard was pretty much bragging in this video, saying, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." This video was 2 hours long, but they had to stop the screening whenever the tape showed Richard performing oral sex on another man. From behind the camera, another prisoner asked Richard if he had killed the nurses. He said, "Sure I did." When someone asked him why, Richard shrugged and, jokingly, being very sarcastic, said it just wasn't their night. Someone asked him how he felt about himself in the following years, and he said, "Like I always felt, I had no feeling. If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no." He also described in detail the experience of strangling someone. "It's not like TV. It takes over 3 minutes, and you have to have a lot of strength." Richard died of a heart attack on December 5th, 1991, the evening of his 50th birthday. His sister Martha feared that his grave would be desecrated, so he had absolutely no physical resting place. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a secret location. And that's the end of Richard Speck. If you've seen American Horror Story Season 1, I'm sure you understand where this inspiration came from. And actually, every single episode in my Daily Kaylee 13 Days of Halloween lineup inspired American Horror Story. So stay tuned. I'll see you in a few days. Bye, guys.